5 Shermans to kill 1 tiger. That was the conventional wisdom. The M4 Sherman was so inferior to German tanks that it took 5 of them to have a chance against a single tiger or Panther. 5 American tanks destroyed for every German tank knocked out. That's the myth. It's been repeated in books, movies, and video games for 80 years. The Sherman was a death trap. American tank crews went into battle knowing they were outgunned, out-armored, and outclassed. The only thing they had going for them was numbers. But the German tank commanders who actually faced Shermans in combat told a different story, a story that contradicted the propaganda, a story about American crews who were aggressive, relentless, and terrifyingly effective. They didn't call Sherman crews cowards, they called them reckless. This is the story of what German Panzer commanders really thought about the M4 Sherman and the men who crewed it, the reports they sent back to Berlin, the assessments they gave after the war, the truth about the tank battle for Europe that challenges everything you think you know. Otto Carius was one of Germany's greatest tank aces. By the end of the war, he had destroyed over 150 enemy tanks, most of them on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. He commanded a Tiger tank, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. He wore the Knight's Cross, the highest decoration Germany could bestow. Carius was transferred to the Western Front in 1944, where he first encountered American armor. What he found surprised him. The American crews were not at all what German propaganda had led him to expect. The Americans fought differently than the Russians, Carius wrote after the war. The Russians would throw tanks at us in waves, carelessly, accepting enormous losses. The Americans were more intelligent. They used combined arms. Infantry worked with tanks. Artillery supported every attack. Air power was constant. They were not as reckless as the Russians, but they were aggressive in a different way. That word kept appearing in German assessments, aggressive. American tank crews didn't hang back. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They attacked. They kept attacking. And when they lost tanks, more tanks appeared to take their place. Carius was particularly struck by American willingness to take risks. They would charge positions that any sensible tanker would approach cautiously, he observed. We thought they were reckless, but there was method to it. They kept us off balance. We never knew where the next attack would come from or how many tanks would be in it. Hans von Luck was another German officer who left detailed observations of American armor. Unlike Carius, von Luck commanded lighter vehicles and often observed tank battles rather than participating directly in them. His perspective was different, but equally illuminating. Von Luck first encountered American tanks in North Africa, then again in Normandy. He was struck by how quickly American crews learned and adapted. In North Africa, they were inexperienced. They made mistakes that cost them dearly. But by Normandy, they had learned. They were different soldiers, hardened, professional. What impressed von Luck most was American coordination. Sherman tanks rarely operated alone. They worked in platoons and companies, supporting each other, communicating by radio, reacting quickly to changing situations. This was a different approach than the Germans typically faced. Their radio discipline was excellent, von Luck noted. Every tank could talk to every other tank. They could coordinate maneuvers in seconds. We had radios, but not in every vehicle. The Americans did. It made them very dangerous. The Tiger and Panther tanks that the Germans fielded were technically superior to the Sherman. No one disputed that. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's gun couldn't even penetrate Tiger armor. On paper, it was no contest. But tank battles aren't fought on paper. The Sherman had advantages that don't show up in specification sheets. It was reliable. German tanks broke down constantly. The Tiger had a transmission that was notorious for failure. The Panther had engine problems that plagued it throughout the war. Both tanks were so heavy that many bridges couldn't support them. The Sherman just worked. It started in the morning, it ran all day, it kept running the next day and the day after that. German Panzer commanders complained endlessly about maintenance, about spare parts, about tanks sitting useless waiting for repairs. American commanders complained about other things, but mechanical reliability wasn't high on the list. The Sherman was also fast. It could cover ground that heavier German tanks couldn't manage. It could retreat when necessary and redeploy quickly. German commanders noted that American tanks seemed to appear everywhere at once, attacking from unexpected directions, then vanishing before a response could be organized. Most importantly, there were a lot of Shermans. American industry produced over 49,000 M4 Shermans during the war. Germany produced fewer than 6,000 Tigers and Panthers combined. When a Sherman was destroyed, another took its place. When a Tiger was destroyed, it was often irreplaceable. German commanders understood this mathematics perfectly. Otto Carius wrote, "We could win every battle and still lose the war. For every tank we destroyed, 3 more appeared. Our replacement rate was a fraction of theirs. We were being overwhelmed not by superior tanks, but by superior production." The hedgerow country of Normandy was a nightmare for armor. The bocage, as the French called it, was a maze of small fields bordered by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation. Tanks couldn't see more than a few hundred yards. Every hedgerow could hide an anti-tank gun. Every corner could conceal a Panzerfaust team. German defenders loved the bocage. It negated American advantages in numbers and mobility. Each field had to be taken individually at terrible cost. A single Tiger, well positioned, could hold an entire battalion at bay. American tank crews adapted. They developed new tactics specifically for the hedgerows. Sergeant Curtis Cullen invented a device made from German beach obstacles that allowed Shermans to cut through the hedgerows instead of going around them. The Rhino tanks, as they were called, could appear anywhere, not just at the gaps the Germans expected them to use. German commanders noticed the innovation. The Americans were constantly developing new methods, one officer reported. Just when we thought we understood their tactics, they changed them. The hedgerow cutters were a surprise. We had prepared defenses at the natural crossing points. Suddenly, the Americans were coming through the hedgerows themselves. This adaptability impressed the Germans more than American equipment did. The Sherman might be inferior to the Tiger, but the men inside it were learning faster than the Germans could respond. What truly frustrated German Panzer commanders was the American approach to combined arms warfare. A Sherman rarely attacked alone. It came with infantry support, artillery cover, and air superiority. Attacking a Sherman meant dealing with all of those threats simultaneously. An anonymous German staff officer interviewed after the war gave this assessment. The Sherman tank by itself was not impressive, but the Americans never used it by itself. There was always infantry to protect it from our Panzerfaust teams. There was always artillery to suppress our anti-tank guns. There were always aircraft overhead, ready to attack any position we revealed. Fighting the Sherman meant fighting the entire American military system. The air power was particularly devastating. American P-47 Thunderbolts roamed the skies over France, attacking any German vehicle that moved during daylight. Tiger tanks that could have devastated Sherman formations were destroyed while moving to the front or while hiding in woods they thought were safe. Otto Carius wrote bitterly about air attacks. We could only move at night. During the day, the jobos were everywhere. Any vehicle that moved was attacked. We lost more tanks to aircraft than to enemy tanks. The Americans controlled the sky, and that meant they controlled everything beneath it. This was the reality German tank commanders faced. Yes, their tanks were better in a one-on-one duel, but how often did they get a one-on-one duel? The Americans made sure the answer was almost never. The word reckless appeared repeatedly in German assessments of American tank crews. It was not entirely a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. German officers used it to describe behavior they found surprising and difficult to counter. A Panzer officer who fought at Mortain described an engagement that stuck with him. We had 3 Panthers in prepared positions, excellent fields of fire. The Americans came at us with a company of Shermans, perhaps 15 tanks. We knocked out 4 of them in the first minutes. Any sensible commander would have withdrawn, called for artillery, tried another approach. The Americans didn't withdraw. They split into 3 groups and attacked from different directions simultaneously. While we engaged one group, another flanked us. We destroyed 6 more Shermans, but they got behind one of our Panthers and knocked it out. Then they called in artillery on our position, and we had to withdraw. They lost 10 tanks. We lost 1, but they held the ground. This pattern repeated across the Western Front. American crews accepted losses that German commanders found astonishing. They pressed attacks that seemed suicidal, and somehow they kept coming. Hans von Luck offered an explanation. The Americans knew their tanks were inferior. They knew they might die. But they also knew that retreat meant fighting the same battle again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. They chose to accept losses now, rather than prolong the war. It was not reckless in the way we first thought. It was calculated aggression. This calculation made sense when you considered the larger picture. America could replace destroyed tanks. Germany could not. America could replace lost crews. Germany was running out of trained men. The math favored aggression, even costly aggression. German commanders understood this, even as they struggled against it. Every engagement, even one they won, brought them closer to defeat. They were being ground down by an enemy who could afford to lose. Beyond tactics and equipment, German commanders were impressed by the quality of American crews. This was perhaps the most surprising observation, given how much wartime propaganda had emphasized American softness and lack of fighting spirit. A captured German Panzer captain, interviewed by American intelligence officers, gave this assessment: "Your tank crews were well trained, better trained than our replacements, certainly. They worked well together. They communicated well. When one tank was hit, the others reacted immediately, not in panic, but with discipline. We expected soft Americans. We found professional soldiers." The professionalism extended to maintenance and support. American tank crews kept their vehicles running. They performed preventive maintenance religiously. They had spare parts. They had recovery vehicles to tow damaged tanks to repair depots. The entire support system was something German commanders envied. "We spent half our time trying to keep our tanks operational," one German officer complained. "The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts. Their logistics were remarkable. A Sherman that broke down in the morning was repaired by evening. Our Tigers waited weeks for parts that never came." This logistical superiority multiplied the effectiveness of every Sherman in the field. American tanks were available to fight. German tanks were too often waiting for repairs. By late 1944, German Panzer commanders knew they were losing, not just the tank battles, but the entire war. The superiority of their equipment couldn't compensate for American numerical advantage. Every engagement, win or lose, brought them closer to defeat. Otto Carius described the psychology. "We could still win individual engagements. A Tiger, well handled, could still destroy many Shermans. But what did it matter? We were running out of Tigers. We were running out of fuel. We were running out of trained crews. The Americans just kept coming with more tanks, more men, more supplies. We were drowning in their abundance." The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 illustrated this reality starkly. German armor achieved initial surprise, pushing American forces back in the largest battle of the Western Front. Tiger and Panther tanks seemed unstoppable in the early days, but the Germans couldn't sustain the offensive. They ran out of fuel. They ran out of replacements. American reinforcements poured in, including hundreds of Shermans that plugged the gaps and counterattacked. Within weeks, the German offensive had collapsed. A German staff officer reflected, "The Bulge was our last chance. We threw everything we had at the Americans. We achieved surprise. We had local superiority, and still we failed. Not because the Americans outfought us, but because they outproduced us, outsupplied us, outlasted us. They simply had more of everything." Operation Cobra in July 1944 showed what happened when American armor was finally unleashed. After weeks of grind in combat in the hedgerows, American forces broke through the German lines and poured into open country. Shermans raced across France, covering distances that shocked German commanders. Hans von Luck described the chaos. "Suddenly there were American tanks everywhere, behind us, on our flanks, in places we thought were secure. They moved faster than we could react. Our defense lines became meaningless when they could simply go around them." The Sherman's reliability became a decisive advantage in the breakout. German tanks broke down on the retreat. American tanks kept running. The pursuit was relentless. Entire German divisions were encircled and destroyed because they couldn't move fast enough to escape. A German Panzer officer captured during the Falaise pocket gave this account. "We were surrounded because our tanks couldn't run. Half were broken down, the rest had no fuel. The Americans drove right past us, their tanks working perfectly, fuel trucks following. We had the better tanks, they had the better army." After the war, American intelligence officers conducted extensive interviews with surviving German Panzer commanders. The interviews were designed to gather lessons for future armored warfare. What emerged was a picture of grudging respect for American tank crews and tactics. Asked to summarize American strengths, one German general listed production capacity, logistics, air superiority, radio communications, crew training, aggressive tactics, willingness to accept losses for tactical gains. Asked about weaknesses, he was more hesitant. Their tanks were not as good as ours, but they compensated with other advantages. By the end, their crews were more experienced than ours because they had replaced their losses and we had not. The Sherman was adequate for the tactics they employed. Another officer, asked directly about the 5 Shermans to 1 Tiger myth, responded, "This is too simple. Yes, the Tiger was more powerful, but the Americans never sent 5 Shermans against 1 Tiger. They sent aircraft against the Tiger. They sent artillery. They attacked from multiple directions. They called in support we couldn't match. It was never a fair fight, and the Americans made sure of that." Otto Carius, in his post-war memoir, gave perhaps the most balanced assessment. The Sherman was not a great tank, but it was a good enough tank produced in enormous numbers, crewed by brave men, supported by overwhelming air power and logistics. The Americans did not need a great tank, they had a great army. The story of German Panzer commanders and their assessment of Sherman crews challenges the simple narrative of technological superiority. Yes, German tanks were technically superior. Yes, the Sherman had weaknesses that cost American lives. Yes, tankers knew they faced long odds in one-on-one engagements. But wars aren't won by tanks alone. They're won by armies. And the American army that fielded the Sherman was superior in ways that mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. The men who crewed the Sherman weren't victims of American industrial planning. They were part of a system designed to win wars, not tank duels. They accepted higher losses in individual engagements because those losses led to victory in the campaign. German commanders called them reckless. Perhaps they were, but it was the recklessness of men who understood that hesitation meant more dying later, that aggression, even costly aggression, shortened the war, that the only way out was through. Today, Sherman tanks sit in museums and memorials around the world. Veterans still gather to remember the machines that carried them through Europe. They don't remember the Sherman as a death trap. They remember it as the tank that brought them home. And German Panzer commanders, interviewed decades after the war, remembered something else. Not the technical superiority of their Tigers and Panthers. Not the kill ratios that supposedly proved their dominance. They remembered the relentless pressure, the endless reinforcements, the reckless Americans who kept coming no matter how many they lost. That was what won the war. Not the best tanks, the best army, the best system, and crews brave enough to charge into battle, knowing the odds were against them. Reckless? Perhaps. Victorious? Absolutely.